If you are of a certain age in Britain, you remember the little three-wheeled Scammell lorry. You may never have known the name, but you saw it every day of your childhood, snub-nosed, buzzing across a railway forecourt with a trailer of parcels behind it, doing the work the horse once did. The firm that built it, in a modest factory in Watford, was the undisputed master of heavy transport on earth, employing close to 1,000 people, building the biggest lorries in the world, the tank transporters, the recovery giants, the machines that moved the loads that powered the nation. It survived the Depression. It survived the war. It survived the coming of the motorway and the invasion of the foreign lorry. Everything the 20th century could throw at it for 66 years. And then, in 1988, the gates closed and the works fell silent for good. How does a firm that survived all of that simply disappear? What really happened behind those gates? Chapter 1. A wheelwright in the East End. Every empire begins with a first workshop. Scammell's stood in Fashion Street, in Spitalfields, in the East End of London, and it did not build lorries. It built carts. This was the 1890s. Horse-drawn London, a city moving on hooves and cartwheels, on the patient clop and rumble of 1 million deliveries a day, and among the yards and workshops that kept it moving was a small coach building and wheelwright's business trading under the name G. Scammell and Nephew. The founder was George Scammell, a craftsman of the old kind, and his was a trade you learned with your hands over years, not one you picked up from a book. Think about what a wheelwright actually did. He took seasoned timber and shaped it into spokes, set them into a hub, bound them with a felloe, and then shrank a red-hot iron tire around the whole thing, so that as the metal cooled, it clamped the wooden wheel into a single unbreakable disc. Get it wrong by a fraction, and the wheel shook itself apart on the first mile of cobbles. Get it right, and it carried a loaded cart through a London winter and came back for more. It was precise, unforgiving work, and it bred a particular kind of man, one who measured twice, trusted nothing, and took a quiet, stubborn pride in making things that did not break. That temperament would still be alive in the Watford factory 60 years later. It was in the firm's blood from the very first wheel. George had brought his nephew Richard into the business, and in time Richard's own sons, Alfred and James, came in behind him. 3 generations of one family bent over the same craft in the same East End yard. And for a while, that craft was enough. But George Scammell had a good eye for where the money was drifting, and by the turn of the century, it was drifting away from the horse. The firm began to sell and to service something new and loud and faintly ridiculous, the Foden steam wagon, a snorting, coal-fired road engine that promised to do the work of a whole stable of horses without ever needing to be fed overnight. Scammell became agents for these machines. They learned to keep them running, to coax them, to repair them when they failed. And in doing so, a family of wheelwrights quietly became something else entirely, mechanics of the coming age. They had 1 foot in the world of the horse and 1 foot in the world of the engine, which is precisely the place where a great many fortunes were about to be made. The man who lit the fuse, though, was not a Scammell at all. He was a haulier named Edward Rudd. Rudd had got his hands on an American machine, a Knox tractor, a stubby, powerful, purposeful thing designed to haul a heavy trailer on a small number of wheels. And Rudd, who moved goods for a living and understood the trade from the road up, saw something in it that the whole of British haulage had somehow missed. Here was a way to carry an enormous payload while keeping very little weight pressing down on any single axle. In most countries, that would have been a nice efficiency. In Britain, it was close to revolutionary, because Britain was a nation of weak roads and weaker bridges, and a lorry that concentrated too much weight on one spot was a lorry that was simply banned from half the country's crossings. A machine that spread its load could go where others could not. It could, in effect, unlock roads that had been closed to heavy haulage since they were built. Rudd took the idea to Scammell, the firm he already trusted with his machines, and asked a simple question. Could they build him something like the Knox, only better? And British? They said yes. And then the world caught fire. The Great War interrupted everything. It emptied the workshops of young men and sent them to France, and among them went Alfred George Scammell, who had come home a lieutenant colonel, wounded, invalided out of the army, and carrying in his head 4 years of hard schooling in what machines could do when a nation's survival depended on them. He had seen mechanical transport haul guns through Flanders mud that would have swallowed a horse whole. He had seen the lorry stop being a novelty and become a weapon of war, and the lesson he brought back to Watford was one that peacetime Britain was still slow to believe. Mechanical road transport worked. It could go where the railways couldn't reach, carry what horses couldn't lift, and keep going long after everything else had failed. Colonel Scammell came home to a family firm that had been holding an idea in reserve, Rudd's idea, and now, at last, there was a man with the vision and the authority to build it. Chapter 2. 7.5 tons at 3-ton cost. The problem they were trying to solve was not really an engineering problem at all. It was a problem of the law. In those years, British law throttled any goods vehicle hauling a trailer down to a crawl, 5 miles an hour, and demanded a second man ride along, purely to satisfy the regulations. It was a rule written for the age of the lumbering traction engine, and it strangled the economics of heavy haulage before a wheel had even turned. Why buy a machine that could carry a fortune's worth of goods if the law made it crawl along at walking pace with a spare man idling in the cab? But there was a loophole hidden inside the wording, and Scammell's men found it. Build the load carrier not as a separate trailer being towed behind, but as part of the vehicle itself, an articulated machine, tractor and semi-trailer married together, hinged in the middle so that the trailer rested its weight on the tractor. In the eyes of the law, that was not a lorry and trailer at all. That was a single vehicle, and a single vehicle could legally run at 12 miles an hour, with one man carrying 7.5 tons. 12 miles an hour against 5, 7.5 tons for the speed and cost of 3. That was the whole business in a single sentence, and it was the chief designer, Percy Garibaldi Hugh, who turned the sentence into steel. Hugh drew up the articulated six-wheeler, and Scammell carried it to the commercial motor show at Olympia in 1920 with an advertising line that told every haulier in the hall exactly what they were looking at. 7.5 tons at 3 tons speed and cost. 50 orders were taken at the show. 50 for a machine that barely existed yet, from a firm that had never built one in numbers. Then they proved it, the hard way, on a hill. West Hill in Highgate was one of those cruel London gradients that hauliers used as a test of a machine's honesty, the sort of slope where a boastful lorry showed its true character halfway up, engine screaming, load winning. Scammell sent a laden test vehicle at it, carrying very nearly 8 tons, and it climbed the hill in second gear, steadily, without drama, and then ran along the flat at 18 miles an hour. In the haulage trade, that kind of news travelled at the speed of gossip. The orders kept coming. They reached 150, and that number carried a small disaster inside it. The Fashion Street workshop, the old East End yard of a family of wheelwrights, could not possibly build 150 of these machines. The idea had outgrown the place that dreamed it. So in 1921, the firm did the one thing that turns a workshop into an industry. It floated a public company, Scammell Lorries Limited, with a capital of £250,000, and went looking for room to build. It found that room in Hertfordshire, on the western edge of Watford, on a site at Talpit's Lane beside the little Watford West station. The works opened its gates in the spring of 1922. Colonel Alfred Scammell was managing director. Percy Hugh was technical director, and around the boardroom table sat a chairman named James Allen and a scattering of backers, among them Edward Rudd himself, the haulier whose imported American tractor had started all of it. And then, in that same founding year, a young engineer walked through the Watford gates who would become the soul of the entire enterprise. His name was Oliver Danson North. O.D. North, everyone called him. He was born in 1887, and he would spend the rest of his working life turning Scammell into the most inventive heavy vehicle firm in the world. If Colonel Scammell was the company's nerve, and Percy Hugh its first hand, then O.D. North was its genius, the man who looked at problems everyone else called impossible and treated them as merely difficult. His first great statement came out of the Shell Company. Scammell had won early work supplying tank wagons to Shell mechs, and North took the ordinary idea of a fuel lorry and threw away its most basic assumption. Why, he asked, should a tanker have a chassis at all? Why carry the dead weight of a heavy steel frame and a heavy steel tank when the tank was already a strong steel cylinder perfectly capable of being the backbone of the whole vehicle? In 1926, Scammell patented the answer, the world's first frameless tanker, in which the tank itself carried all the loads. It was lighter, it carried more, and it was so obviously, elegantly right that the principle survives on the motorways of the world to this day. That was North in a single decision. He didn't decorate problems, he dissolved them. But it was in 1929 that O.D. North built the machine that told the whole world exactly what Scammell was for. They called it, without ceremony, the 100-tonner. It was the largest lorry on Earth. Only 2 were ever made. The first went to Marston Road Services in Liverpool, where its job was to carry entire steam locomotives down to the docks. The second went to a haulier named Coley at Dartford. And to stand beside one of these things was to understand that Scammell had walked out of the ordinary lorry trade altogether and into a category of one. Its first engine, a 7-litre Scammell petrol unit, drank a gallon of fuel every 3/4 of a mile, a thirst so heroic that the machine was later rebuilt with a Gardner diesel, after which it managed a merely colossal 4 miles to the gallon. The heaviest load one of them is recorded as carrying was 165 tons. There was no power steering. There was no possibility of stopping such a thing in a hurry. And so the 100-tonner carried a second crewman who rode at the very back, on the 80-ton carrier bogie, with one job and one job only, to work the brakes on that rear section. He was connected to the driver up front by a telephone line, so that the driver could call back down the length of the machine and tell him when to start slowing 165 tons of locomotive down. Laden, the whole cathedral of steel moved at 3 miles an hour. Picture that for a moment. A man on a telephone at the back of the biggest lorry in the world, waiting for the call to brake. That was Scammell at the very beginning, not building transport, but building the impossible, one telephone call at a time. And every rival in Britain was building something else entirely. Chapter 3. The Walking Beam and the Mechanical Horse. Here is the thing to understand about Scammell, the thing that explains both its glory and, in the end, its death. While the great names of the British lorry trade fought each other for the ordinary road haulier, while AEC and Guy and Leyland built solid, sensible, mass-produced machines to carry sensible loads down sensible roads, Scammell deliberately turned the other way. It went towards the loads nobody else wanted. The too big, the too heavy, the too strange. It made itself indispensable precisely by refusing to compete where everyone else competed. That was a magnificent strategy. It was also a lonely one. A firm that lives at the very top of the market lives on a narrow ledge, and in the early 1930s, that ledge nearly gave way. Because a firm that builds 2 of the largest lorries on Earth is not a firm with a broad, safe income. Scammell's machines were top of the range, expensive, and built in tiny numbers, and money was always tight at Talbot's Lane. When the Depression came down over Britain, it came down hardest on exactly this kind of business. The specialist, the luxury, the purchaser haulier could always put off for another year. By 1934, the company was in genuine doors-closing trouble. What saved it was a mixture of local loyalty and corporate rescue, and the rescue came at a price, as rescue usually does. Watford Council stepped in with an order for a pair of fire engines, a small thing, but a lifeline, the town keeping its own works alive. And Shellmex, the great customer, injected the capital that kept the gates open. But Shell demanded something in return. It demanded a shakeout of the management, and in the reshuffle that followed, Colonel Alfred Scammell, the wounded soldier who had carried Rudd's idea home from the war, lost his place at the head of the firm that bore his name. The company survived. Its founder figure did not survive with it. A larger power had reached in, saved Scammell, and taken a piece of its soul as payment. It would not be the last time. Remember that shape. It is the shape of everything that happens at the very end. The company that came through the Depression did so by widening North's genius beyond sheer size. And here he produced 2 of the most remarkable machines the British road ever carried. The first grew out of a hard truth. An ordinary lorry, however powerful, is helpless the moment the ground stops being flat. Take it into an oil field, a logging camp, a building site churned to mud, and its wheels lose their grip, and it sits there, beaten by nothing more than terrain. North's answer, in 1927, was the Scammell Pioneer, and its secret was a piece of engineering called the Walking Beam Bogie. Understand what he did, because it is pure North. On an ordinary lorry, the rear axles are bolted rigidly to the frame, so the moment one wheel drops into a hole or rides up over a rock, it either loses contact with the ground or lifts a wheel elsewhere, and either way, it loses grip. North refused to accept that. He mounted the rear wheels on pivoting beams so that any one of the four could rise as much as 2 feet, the height of a kitchen table, while the other 3 stayed planted and pulling. Then he let the front axle rock sideways too. The result was a lorry that draped itself over broken ground like a living thing, always keeping its wheels in contact with the earth, always finding traction where a rigid machine would simply spin and stop. Nothing else in Britain could do what the Pioneer did. It went out to the oil fields of the Middle East and the logging tracts of the world, selling on a single, unanswerable promise that it would get through where nothing else could. And here is the detail that matters for everything that came later. The Pioneer was never designed as a military vehicle at all. It was a commercial cross-country tractor built for oilmen and loggers. The army would come to it only because, when it eventually went looking for something that could drag heavy guns and broken tanks across a battlefield, it discovered that Scammell had already built the answer, years before, for entirely peaceful reasons. North's second machine of the era went the opposite way, small, nimble, and destined to become the one Scammell that ordinary Britons actually knew by sight. This was the mechanical horse of 1934, a strange, snub-nosed, 3-wheeled town tractor built to do exactly what its name suggested. Replace the horse. The idea came from the London and North Eastern Railway, which was drowning in the cost of keeping thousands of actual horses to pull its parcels vans through every town it served. The concept had been developed by Napier, and Scammell bought it, but it was North who made it work. He gave it a single front wheel that could steer through a full 360 degrees, so the little machine could spin almost within its own length in a cramped railway goods yard. And he gave it his small masterpiece, an automatic coupling. A driver could reverse the mechanical horse up to a waiting trailer, hear it lock home, and drive away, coupled and gone, without once leaving his seat. Decades ahead of its time. It sold in a 3-ton version and a heavier 6-ton version, and it became a fixture of British life, buzzing about the goods yards and delivery rounds of every town in the land. Its successor carried a name that nearly everyone thinks they understand, and nearly everyone gets wrong. The machine that followed the mechanical horse was called the Scarab, and no, it was not named for the beetle, however neatly the beetle fits its rounded bonnet. Scammell's own advertising film confirmed the truth. Scarab was a portmanteau, Scammell and Arab, the Arab horse it had been built to replace. A mechanical horse, named after the horse. So complete was the little machine's conquest that it was licensed abroad. In France, from 1937, the firm of Chenard-Valcke built its own version under the name Pony Mécanique, powered by the engine of a Citroën traction Avant, and the French went on building their pony long after the war, all the way through to 1970. An East End wheelwright's idea, trotting round the streets of France for the better part of 40 years. Chapter 4. The War Machine. When the storm broke over Europe in 1939, the British Army went looking for machines that could do the undoable, and found that a small factory in Watford had been quietly building them for a decade. The Pioneer went to war. That cross-country tractor built for oil fields turned out to be precisely what a mechanized army needed, and Scammell built it in 3 great families of purpose, each answering a different, desperate need. First, the gun tractor, the army's heavy artillery, the 6-inch guns, the 7.2-inch howitzers, the long American 155 they nicknamed the Long Tom, were monsters that had to be dragged into position across whatever ground the fighting happened to occupy. The Pioneer artillery tractor, powered by the unburstable Gardner 6-cylinder diesel, took that job and never complained. Close to 1,000 of them were built to haul the guns, and the men who drove them trusted them the way you trust a thing that has never once let you down. Second, the recovery vehicle, the machine that saved the other machines. A battlefield is a graveyard of the mechanical, tanks bogged to their bellies, lorries ditched and abandoned, and always someone has to go out, often under fire, and drag them home. Scammell built the heavy breakdown Pioneer for exactly that work, fitting it with a crane and winching gear, and turned out getting on for 2,000 of them. Where other recovery vehicles strained and gave up, the Scammell went in, hooked on, and pulled. It did the ugly, unglamorous, essential work, and it did it in every theatre of the war. And third, the tank transporter, the role that would define Scammell for the rest of its natural life. Even in the 1930s, Scammell was building machines to carry 20 and 30 tons of tank on their backs, sparing the tank's own tracks the ruinous wear of long road marches. It was a modest beginning. It would grow in time into the greatest tank transporters the British Army ever owned. Altogether, across every variant and every year, Scammell built about 3,400 pioneers. For a firm that had once nearly gone under building luxuries in tiny numbers, it was a transformation, and a proof of the thing North had understood from the very start. Build something genuinely, completely tough, and the world will eventually come to your door needing exactly that. The pioneers earned their reputation in the worst circumstances imaginable. Many were lost in France in 1940, left behind in the catastrophe of the retreat to Dunkirk, abandoned on the roadsides and beaches, not because they had failed, but because there was simply no way to bring them home across the Channel. To lose your machines in a defeat like that, and to keep building them anyway, and to watch them come back stronger for the rest of the war, that tells you something about how sound the design was underneath. Because the story of the pioneer did not end with the war. It did not end anywhere close to it. The very last pioneer recovery vehicles were still in British military service into the 1980s, soldiering on in Belize, in Central America, more than half a century after O.D. North first sketched the walking beam bogey for the oil fields. A machine designed before the Depression, still dragging the Army's wreckage home in the decade of the personal computer. Nothing captures the Scammell promise more completely than that. They built things that outlived the world they were built for. There was one last trick North's engineers gave the pioneer, and it captures the whole spirit of the place. When even the walking beam bogey wasn't enough, when the ground was too soft, too broken, too utterly impossible, a set of tracks could be fitted over the rear wheels, turning the wheeled lorry into a half-track on the spot. A machine that changed its own nature to suit the ground beneath it. That was Watford at war. Not a mass production line stamping out thousands of identical machines a week, the way the great volume factories did. Something rarer, and in its way more valuable. A works full of engineers who solved the problems nobody else could solve, and built the machines nobody else could build. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, Scammell was no longer an East End experiment, nor a Depression survivor scraping through. It was something the nation had learned it could not do without. The undisputed master of heavy, abnormal, and military transport. A name that meant one thing above all others. When the load was too big, too heavy, too impossible for anything else on wheels, you sent for Scammell. And in that hard-won mastery, in that reputation for building things that simply would not break, lay the whole of Scammell's future, its glory. And, though no one standing in the victory of 1945 could have dreamed it, the seed of the way it would one day die. Chapter 5. The Indestructibles. Imagine walking up Tolpit's Lane on a cold morning in the middle 1950s, with the works hooter still ringing in the damp air and the men filing in from the little Watford West station beside the gates. You would not, at first glance, have known you were looking at the most respected heavy vehicle factory on earth. There were no vast assembly halls stretching to the horizon, no great river of identical machines flowing down a moving line. Scammell did not look like Longbridge or Dagenham. It looked like what it was. A specialist works, low and busy and purposeful, where things were made slowly and made properly. And that was the whole point of it. Come through the gates on that morning, and the first thing to reach you would be the smell. Hot metal and cutting oil, the sharp tang of the welding shop, the particular scent of a place where steel was being worked hard. Then the sound, not the relentless hammer of a production line, but something more irregular and more human. The clang of a heavy component being lowered into place, the hiss of an airline, the rise and fall of a man's voice calling to another across a half-built chassis, and everywhere, the machines themselves, in every state of becoming, a bare frame here, a nearly finished giant there, each one taking shape at its own pace. Because inside those gates, nothing was mass-produced. A Scammell was not stamped out. It was built, largely by hand, by men who understood that the machine leaving their care might spend the next 40 years dragging power station transformers across the country or hauling tanks across a battlefield, and had better not fail while it did. Walk the length of the erecting shop and you could follow a contractor coming into existence, starting as a great bare chassis frame laid out on trestles, then gaining its axles and its bogie, the driveline threaded through, the engine lowered in on chains, the cab set on last of all. It did not move down a line to the men. The men moved to it, and it stayed on its trestles for as long as the work honestly took. The pace was the pace of craft. There is a piece of testimony from a man who lived it, an engineer named John Fidel, who came to Watford in 1968 and stayed until the very end, and he put his finger on exactly what made the place different. "We were totally different to the mass producers of AEC, Guy, and even Leyland," he said, "as we did all the exotic specials, so a lot of people on the shop floor were quite fulfilled. Fulfilled. It is not a word you hear much about factory work, but it was the truth of Watford. A man on that shop floor was not tightening the same 3 bolts 10,000 times a day. He was building a thing that had never quite existed before, because at Scammell, almost every serious order was, in some sense, a one-off. Think of the coppersmith bending pipe for a bespoke cooling system that would only ever fit this one machine. The panel beater shaping a cab by eye and hand. The fitter assembling a 40-ton bogie who knew, as he torqued each joint, that a tank the weight of a house would one day ride on his work across a battlefield, and that a life might depend on whether he had done it right. These were not assemblers. They were makers, and the difference showed in everything that left the gates. Fidel described the engineering culture in a single sentence that tells you why the best young men in the trade wanted to work there. There was great scope for young engineers to be given a lot of responsibility, he said. If you showed an interest in something, you normally ended up doing it. That was the opposite of the great volume factories, where a young engineer might spend a decade refining the door handle on a saloon car. At Watford, if you showed you could do it, they handed you a problem the size of a house and let you solve it. You might find yourself, at 26, responsible for the running gear of a machine built to recover a 60-ton tank. The products that came out of that culture in the post-war years read like a roll call of the impossible. The first off the mark, in 1946, was the show track, a heavy tractor built specifically for the showland trade, for the fairground families who moved the great travelling fairs from town to town and generated their own electric light from a dynamo mounted behind the cab. Only 18 show tracks were ever built, and here is the measure of how much they were loved, and how well they were made. Of those 17 still survive today. Not 17%, 17 machines. You do not get a survival rate like that from a vehicle people merely used. You get it from a vehicle people refused to let die. Then came the machines that carried Scammell's cross-country genius into the piece. The Mountaineer in 1949, a 4-wheel drive workhorse for the construction trade. The Explorer in 1950, a 6-wheel drive recovery vehicle that took over the pioneers' old battlefield job of dragging home the wreckage of war. The Army gave it the designation FV 11301, and it carried a great snarling Meadows petrol engine of 10 1/3 litres, because the War Office in those years still insisted that frontline vehicles run on petrol rather than diesel. The Explorer went to Korea. It was built to recover the biggest tanks Britain then owned, the Centurion and the vast Conqueror, which is to say it was built to lift and drag machines that themselves weighed as much as a small house, out of mud, under fire, and bring them home. And above them all, from the early 1950s, came the Constructor and the Superconstructor, the true forerunners of the modern cross-country heavy. The Superconstructor carrying a Rolls-Royce turbocharged engine and a semi-automatic gearbox, a machine so far ahead of the ordinary road lorry that it belonged to a different world. But if you asked an ordinary Briton in those years to picture a Scammell, they would not have pictured any of these giants. They would have pictured the little one. Chapter 6. The Horse, that every town remembered. There is a shape that lived in the memory of a whole generation of British people, whether they ever knew the name Scammell or not. A small, snub-nosed, 3-wheeled town tractor, buzzing across a railway station forecourt with a trailer of parcels behind it. If you were a child in Britain between the 1930s and the 1960s, you saw it every single day. It was the scarab, the successor to that mechanical horse that O.D. North had perfected, and it was, quietly, the most successful thing Scammell ever built. Because while the 100-tonner and the Explorer made the headlines, it was the little 3-wheeler that made the numbers. Across all its forms, Scammell built something in the order of 30,000 of these mechanical horses. 30,000. They were everywhere, behind British Railways deliveries, behind the Royal Mail. threading through the narrow yards and tight archways of towns built for the horse, doing precisely the job the horse had done, but faster and without the stable. A scarab could pivot almost within its own length, uncouple its trailer and pick up a fresh one in seconds and shrug off a full working life of stop-start town delivery. And the trailers those little machines pulled came from a second Scammell operation, a few miles off at Moor Park, the Trailer Works, where the semi-trailers and the specialist load-carrying platforms were built to match the tractors that would haul them. 2 sites, 1 philosophy. Build it properly, build it to last, build it so it comes back for more. This was the era of full employment in Watford, when the works carried something close to 1,000 people on its books at its peak in the late 1960s, and when a job at Scammell was a job a family could build a life around. Fathers brought sons in through the gates. The skills passed down the workbench the way the wheelwright's craft had once passed down the generations of the Scammell family itself, by watching, by doing, by being handed a little more responsibility each year, until one day you were the man the young lad watched. A boy might start sweeping the erecting shop at 16 and retire 49 years later as the foreman who could look at a half-built bogey and know, at a glance, whether it was right. And the town lived to the rhythm of the works. The hooter marked the shifts. In the morning, the men came off the branch line train and up Talpitts Lane. In the evening, they went back the same way, or walked home through West Watford to terraced streets, and the pubs filled at the end of the day with talk of the machines. The wage packet came from making things, real things, heavy things, things that would outlast the men who made them. It paid the rent and the coal and the Friday treat, and it did so with the particular dignity of skilled work, of a trade that could not be done by just anyone. The union men were there on the floor too, as they were in every serious British works of the age, part of the fabric of the place, though Scammell's labour record was, remarkably, one of the most peaceful in the whole of British industry, a fact that would ring out with terrible poignancy at the very end. The trade knew what those men could do, and paid Scammell the highest compliment a firm can be paid. They came to Watford for the jobs no one else could take. When a load was genuinely abnormal, a locomotive, a ship's boiler, a power station transformer the size of a house, it went on a Scammell. The great heavy haulage names of Britain built their reputations on Scammell machines. Pickfords ran fleets of them. So did Wynns, and Sunters of Northallerton, and Annis and Company, and Siddlecook, and Heener Haulage, firms whose crews moved the indivisible loads that literally built and powered the country. Picture one of those journeys. A power station transformer, a single indivisible block of copper and steel weighing as much as 100 family cars, has to travel from the factory that built it to the site that needs it. It cannot be taken apart. It will not fit under some bridges or round some corners. So, a Pickford's crew brings a Scammell contractor, couples it to a specialist trailer running on dozens of wheels to spread that colossal weight, and sets off at walking pace, routing round weak bridges, sometimes closing roads through the night, a police escort ahead and a crowd of children running alongside to see the giant pass. It might take days to cover a distance a car would manage in an hour, and at the head of it, doing the pulling, was a machine made at Talpitts Lane. Every transformer that switched on a new town's electricity, every boiler that drove a power station, a great many of them rode there behind, something made at Watford. The name reached beyond the trade too, into the odd corners of the culture. Years later, when Ian Dury and the Blockheads recorded their great list song of small pleasures, Reasons to be Cheerful, there among the things worth living for was a line about 18-wheeler Scammells. The name dropped into a pop hit as a thing an ordinary Englishman simply knew. That was the reach of it. Not a household word, exactly, but a word that lived in the background of British life, on the forecourts and the motorways and, just once, near the top of the charts. But, and this is a truth the eulogist has to tell because it matters enormously for what comes later, the men who drove Scammells did not always love them the way the men who owned them did. Because a Scammell was built for strength, not for comfort. It was hard, unforgiving, physical to drive. A machine that asked a great deal of the man at the wheel and gave him very little in return, but the certainty that it would get the load there. There is a phrase that recurs among the men who knew them. Generally, the vehicles were hard, unforgiving, and uncomfortable to drive. That was the Scammell bargain. It would never let you down. but it would never make the journey pleasant either. Hold on to that. Remember the driver, aching at the end of his shift in a cab built like a fortress. Because one day, quite soon, a Swedish lorry was going to arrive on British roads that was as quiet and comfortable as a saloon car, and the bargain Scammell had always offered was going to look, to a new generation of drivers, less like a virtue and more like a punishment. Chapter 7. The Undisputed King. Step back in the years around 1960 and look at where Scammell stood, and you understand why the men at Watford believed, reasonably, honestly believed, that they had built something permanent. They were the undisputed authority on heavy, abnormal and military transport in the world. Not in Britain, in the world. If you needed to move something that could not be divided and could not be moved by anything ordinary, the answer, on every continent, was very often a machine designed in a modest factory beside a branch line station in Hertfordshire. The Scammell register, the enthusiasts who keep the flame today, do not overstate it much when they call the mark, quite simply, arguably, the greatest name in British commercial road transport. The reach of the place was extraordinary for its size. Scammells worked the oil fields of the Middle East, the logging tracks of the Commonwealth, the mines and dams and construction sites of the developing world. Anywhere the ground was too rough and the loads too heavy for a normal lorry to cope. Wherever in the world a thing needed moving that could not be moved, a Watford machine was likely to be doing the moving, and the versatility of the works could still astonish. In 1964, this factory that built the heaviest tank transporters on Earth also quietly assembled 38 trolleybuses, electric passenger vehicles, for the city of Wellington in New Zealand. A tank transporter and a trolleybus, from the same set of gates, in the same year. There was almost nothing the Watford engineers could not turn their hands to. Leading the firm in these confident years was a managing director named Vic Wilkes, a man the engineers spoke of with real warmth, a leader who understood what made the place special and protected it. With Vic Wilkes at the helm, Fidel remembered, we had a great leader. That mattered, because a specialist works like Scammell was only ever as strong as its ability to hold on to its own character, and a good leader was the man who stood between the craftsmen and anyone who might want to turn them into something more ordinary. And in 1964 came the machine that would carry the firm's reputation right to the end, the Scammell contractor, a colossal prime mover powered by a great American Cummins diesel with a driver's choice of running gear underneath, including Scammell's own 30 and 40-ton bogies. The contractor could handle gross train weights well beyond 200 tons. It became the standard heavy haulage tractor of its generation, and it became a tank transporter that served for decades. It was, in every sense that mattered, still a proper Scammell, designed at Watford, engineered for the impossible, built to outlast everything around it. That was the summit. A firm of perhaps 1,000 people in an unremarkable works in Watford, holding the top of the world's heavy transport trade in its hand, and the men who ran it had every reason to think the view would last. But the ground beneath a firm that sits at the very top of a narrow market is never quite as solid as it looks. And in 1955, nearly a decade before the contractor was even drawn, a decision had already been taken that would decide how this story ended, a decision that felt, at the time, entirely like a rescue. Chapter 8. The Rescue That Was a Trap. In 1955, Scammell Lorries Limited became part of Leyland Motors. Read that sentence the way the men at Watford read it at the time, and it sounds like nothing but good news. Leyland was a giant, a great, respected, profitable maker of lorries and buses, one of the pillars of British engineering. And a small specialist like Scammell, forever short of money, forever building brilliant machines in numbers too small to make the sums easy, had something real to gain. Leyland brought a whole cupboard of first-rate components, engines, gearboxes, axles, that Scammell could now draw upon instead of designing and building every last piece itself. For a firm that had nearly gone under in the Depression and had been rescued once already by Shellmex at the cost of its founder's job, the shelter of a giant looked like safety at last. And for a long time, for the best part of 30 years, it genuinely was. Because here is the crucial thing, the thing that complicates the whole neat story of how Scammell died. Leyland did not march in and gut the place. Leyland left Scammell almost entirely alone, and it did so for the most unsentimental reason imaginable. Scammell made money. The instruction that came down from on high was, in effect, wonderfully simple. As long as the firm turned a profit, it could get on with what it was good at. As long as the exotic specials kept turning a profit, the men at Watford were left to build their giants their own way, to hand their young engineers problems the size of houses. The takeover of 1955 did not begin Scammell's decline. It began Scammell's most confident, best-resourced years, the very golden age we have just walked through. That is the terrible irony sitting at the heart of this story, and it is worth being precise about it, because the easy version, the version everyone half remembers, gets it wrong. The easy version says Leyland's accountants killed Scammell by forcing it to use cheap, shared, generic parts, gluing a Scammell badge onto an ordinary Leyland truck. And there is a grain of truth in it, a grain we will follow carefully in the chapters to come, because standardization was real, and it did creep in at one end of the range. The road haulage machines, the highwayman and the handyman and the routeman did increasingly take Leyland engines and shared cabs. That end of the business did slowly lose its distinct Scammell soul, and the men who had made cabs and gearboxes in-house did watch that work drain away. But the giants did not lose their soul. The contractor kept its bespoke Scammell bogies. The heavy transporters kept their custom engineering. The military machines stayed thoroughbred to the very end. Scammell was not turned into a badge in 1955, or in 1965, or even in 1975. It remained, at its core, exactly what it had always been. A specialist builder of the impossible, kept alive and left alone precisely because it was good at it and profitable at it. So the seeds of the ending were planted in the moment of rescue, yes. But they lay dormant for 2 decades. The trap was set in 1955. It would not spring for 30 years, and when it finally did, the thing that sprang it would not be an axle or a gearbox or a shared cab. It would be something far larger and far colder, and entirely beyond the control of anyone who ever worked at Watford. Because in 1955, Scammell had joined Leyland, and Leyland, in 1955, was strong. That was about to change. And when a small, healthy, profitable specialist is bolted to the side of a giant, its fate stops depending on whether it makes good lorries, and starts depending entirely on whether the giant lives or dies. Standing at the summit in the middle 1960s, with the contractor about to launch and the order books full and 1,000 men proud of their work, nobody at Talpitts Lane could see the cliff. They had survived the Depression. They had survived the war. They were the best in the world at what they did, and they were making money doing it. They could not have known that the greatest danger to Scammell had never been a rival, or a recession, or a rough patch in the trade. It was the size of the friend who had promised to keep them safe. Chapter 9. The Swedish Invasion. It began, as these things often do, not with a disaster, but with a lorry that was simply nicer to drive. At the start of the 1970s, Britain still had a proper truck industry of its own. Around 20 makers, from the giants down to the specialists, building the machines that moved a nation, and ranged against them across the North Sea and the Channel, were something like 45 continental manufacturers, watching the British market with hungry eyes. Britain had money, Britain had motorways going in, and Britain had hauliers who had made do for decades with lorries built to a hard, unsentimental, distinctly British recipe. Then Volvo arrived. The Swedish firm led with a machine called the F86, brought into Britain and eventually assembled in Scotland. The first foreign lorry that British hauliers took to in real numbers, and behind it came the one that changed everything, the Volvo F88. A lorry that hauliers still talk about as the machine that shifted the whole balance of the British market forever. Because the F88 offered the working driver something no British lorry of the old school had ever bothered to give him. A cab you could sleep in, power steering, quiet. So quiet, in fact, that the men who drove them said it was more like sitting in a saloon car than in a lorry. The noise inside the cab of one of these Swedes was measured at levels a British driver of a 1950s machine would not have believed possible. Behind Volvo came Scania, with its 110 and 140. Then DAF from Holland. Then Mercedes-Benz and Magirus Deutz from Germany. A whole continental invasion, and every one of them selling the same thing British makers had never thought worth selling. Comfort, refinement, an easy day at the wheel. Now remember the Scammell bargain. Hard, unforgiving, uncomfortable, but it would never let you down. For 40 years that had been a virtue, a badge of honour almost. But a new generation of drivers had grown up, and a haulier, trying to keep those drivers, trying to fill his cabs, began to hear the same thing from his men. Why am I breaking my back in this British fortress when the firm down the road runs Volvos, and the lads there go home fresh? This hit Scammell's road haulage range hard, the Crusader, the Handyman, the machines that competed for ordinary long-distance work. Against a Volvo, a hard old British road lorry was fighting a battle it could not win, because the ground of the fight had moved from strength, where Scammell was unbeatable, to comfort, where it had never even tried. But, and hold on to this, because it is the whole argument of the film, the invasion barely touched the giants. There was no Volvo tank transporter. There was no Scania that could shift a 200-ton transformer. At the very top of the market, in the realm of the truly abnormal load and the military monster, Scammell still had no rival on earth. The Swedes took the easy trade, the road trade, the comfortable middle. They could not take the impossible. Nobody could take the impossible from Scammell. So the invasion wounded Scammell. It did not kill it. What it did was more subtle and more dangerous. It began to hollow out the British-owned truck industry as a whole, the great structure that Scammell was now, since 1955, merely one small limb of. Of 18 British truck firms trading in 1970, only 11 were left by 1980, and the 1980s would come for the rest. The danger to Scammell, you see, was never really the lorry parked next to it on the motorway. The danger was what was happening to the family it had joined. Chapter 10. Swallowed. To understand how a profitable, world-beating specialist ends up closed, you have to understand the thing it had been folded into, and in 1968, that thing became a monster. For years, Leyland had been gathering up the marques of British commercial vehicles, AEC, Albion, Thornycroft, Guy, assembling a great stable of famous names. That, in itself, was rationalisation of a familiar kind. But in 1968, under Sir Donald Stokes, and actively encouraged by Harold Wilson's government, Leyland went much, much further. It merged with British Motor Holdings, the ailing giant of the British volume car trade, the maker of the Austins and the Morrises, to create a single vast conglomerate, the British Leyland Motor Corporation. Picture the logic of it as it looked from Whitehall. Foreign cars and foreign lorries were pouring into Britain. The answer, the thinking went, was scale. One great British champion, big enough to fight back, a national flag planted in the world market. On paper, it was patriotic. On paper, it made sense. And on paper, the men who signed it believed they were saving British manufacturing, not condemning it. In reality, it chained the profitable, well-run truck and specialist operations, Leyland, Scammell, the lot, to a volume car business that was sliding towards catastrophe. As the trade press would later put it, with the flat clarity of hindsight, once it did that, its demise was inevitable. Think about what that meant for the men at Watford, though most of them could not yet feel it. Scammell was now a single small workshop inside a corporation of around 100 companies. Its profits, real as they were a rounding error against the losses pouring out of the car plants. Its brilliant engineers, its bespoke bogies, its 70 years of hard-won mastery, all of it now sat inside a structure whose attention, whose capital, whose survival was consumed by problems 100 miles away in the Midlands that had nothing whatever to do with lorries. A healthy limb bolted to a body that was beginning to fail, and nobody at Tolpits Lane had signed up for that. Nobody there had voted for it, or wanted it, or could do a single thing about it. The decision that would one day kill Scammell had been taken in a boardroom and a ministry, by men who had, in all likelihood, never once walked the Watford floor, and it had been taken for reasons that had nothing to do with Scammell at all. And into this troubled new giant, more work kept flowing towards Watford, some of it a genuine vote of confidence, some of it the first real taste of the standardisation that the title of this film blames for everything. When Thornycroft's operation at Basingstoke was closed at the turn of the decade, its Nubian crash tender range, the airport fire engines, was moved to Scammell, along with other work, and the firm was even renamed Scammell Motors. The giants were still coming to Watford. The expertise was still valued. But at the other end of the range, the road truck end, the accountant's logic was beginning to bite. And here, at last, we come to the decision that the easy story of Scammell rests everything upon. It is worth walking into that decision carefully, because it is the closest the real history ever comes to the tale the title tells. The Crusader, launched at the end of the 1960s, was the clearest sign of the new thinking. Now, understand the pressure the men making these choices were under. The corporation was vast, its resources stretched, its logic increasingly the logic of the balance sheet. Why should Scammell design and build its own cab at its own cost, in its own shop, when there was a perfectly good cab available to buy in? Why should it engineer a unique heavy bogie for a road tractor when the group already made one that would serve? To an accountant looking at the numbers, it was not vandalism, it was common sense. It was, in the language of the age, rationalization. And rationalization was the great watchword of British industry in those years, spoken as though it were a virtue in itself. So the Crusader was a genuinely capable machine. Its big American Detroit diesel engine gave it far more power than the British norm, and it did fine service, military and civilian. But under the skin, it told a new story. Its cab was not built at Watford. It was a steel cab bought in from an outside supplier, Motor Panels. Its heavy-duty rear bogie was not a bespoke Scammell design. It was an existing Leyland Group unit, shared across the corporation, and when the popular version of the Crusader needed building in numbers, its production was moved away from Watford altogether, to Guy Motors at Wolverhampton. Here, then, is the grain of truth in the badge engineering story. And here is what it cost, on the shop floor, in the lives of the men who worked there. This is what John Fidel meant when he explained why the Watford payroll began to fall. It fell, he said, because they stopped making things like cabs and gearboxes in-house. Think about what that sentence contains. Every cab bought in from Motor Panels was a cab that Watford panel beaters did not shape. Every shared bogie was a job that the Watford fitters did not build. The craft that had made Scammell, the in-house making of the very components, began, at the road truck end, to drain quietly away, and with it drained the men. Not in one great redundancy, but in ones and twos. A shop wound down here, a skill no longer needed there. The slow erosion of a way of working. That was real. That was a genuine loss, and Fidel felt it, and it deserves its place in this story. It is the true fact at the heart of the false legend. But now watch what the easy version of history does with that true fact. It takes this real thing, the standardization of the road range, and it stretches it over the whole company like a shroud. It says, they turned Scammell into a badge, they gutted it. They made it just another Leyland with a different nameplate, and that is why it died. And that is not what happened. Because at the very moment the accountants were sharing out cabs and bogies on the road range, something quite different was about to happen to the giants. Far from being gutted, Scammell's bespoke heavy engineering was about to be handed the biggest investment and the most magnificent machine in its entire history. The men who tell you Leyland killed Scammell by making it cheap have to explain the commander. And they cannot. Chapter 11. Ryder, Edwards, and the Last Investment. By the middle 1970s, the great British Leyland gamble had failed so completely that only the state could catch it. The corporation was hemorrhaging. In December 1974, it needed a government guarantee simply to keep trading, and the Wilson government, unwilling to let the nation's flagship manufacturer collapse, sent in an industrialist named Sir Don Ryder to work out what to do. Picture the scene. A company too big and too symbolic to be allowed to die, a government that could not afford to save it and could not afford to lose it, and one man handed the job of finding a way through. The Ryder report, delivered in the spring of 1975, recommended saving the whole thing, and in June of that year the state effectively took British Leyland into public ownership. The company was carved into divisions: cars, trucks and buses, international and special products, which included the military vehicles. Scammell now sat inside a nationalised behemoth, a small specialist limb on a state-owned giant. It was, by now, deep inside the politics of the age. The company's managing director, John Barber, was ousted. A man named Alex Park became chief executive. On the shop floor of the car plants, the great set-piece battles of 1970s British industry were playing out. The strikes, the walkouts, the union conveners like Derek Robinson, who became household names for all the wrong reasons. Scammell, in Watford, watched this from a strange distance, because its own labour record was the very opposite of the chaos in the Midlands. But it could not escape being tarred with the same brush. To a public reading about British Leyland in the newspapers, all of it, the strike-bound car plants and the peaceful, profitable little truck works in Hertfordshire, was simply Leyland. One name, one reputation, and it was a reputation Scammell had done nothing to earn. And here is a fact the simple story never mentions. Ryder recommended no plant closures. None. Scammell survived the nationalisation intact, not gutted, not shut, but preserved. It had become a political football inside a state enterprise, yes, but it was still there, still building, still bespoke. Then, in 1978, came the man who changed the truck division's fortunes, Sir Michael Edwards, the tough, small, formidable South African brought in to save British Leyland and prepared to fight anyone, unions or ministers, to do it. Edwards had a hard, clear philosophy, and it can be stated in 4 words. Fund only what earns. He looked across his sprawling, bleeding empire with a cold eye, and he asked of every part of it a single brutal question. Does this make money, or does it lose it? And when he turned that eye on the truck operation, something interesting happened. The profitable, expert specialist, works at Watford, was exactly the kind of thing his philosophy favoured. It earned, so it deserved to be funded. Edwards went to the government and secured a massive investment in Leyland's truck and bus business, a new range, new plant, a proper test track, the works. The centrepiece was the T45 range, the road train, styled by Ogle's Tom Carron, carrying a modern tilt cab and voted Truck of the Year in 1981. And Scammell was not stripped by this programme. Scammell was given work by it. This is the point the legend cannot survive. Because Watford had the expertise, Leyland handed it the specialist jobs that the volume plants could not do. The export land train for rough foreign roads, the 8-wheeler heavy version of the new road train, the Constructor 8, and a new heavy tractor called the S24, which took a modern Leyland cab and married it to Scammell's own custom-running gear and an American-style crew pod. The bespoke skills weren't being thrown away. They were being pointed at new work. The very corporation supposedly determined to reduce Scammell to a badge was, in reality, feeding it exactly the kind of specialist engineering it had always done best. And then came the investment that ought to end the badge engineering argument forever. Around 1983, Scammell got something it had never had in 60 years of existence, a modern, state-of-the-art factory, a proper moving line construction shop, built new, at Watford. Leyland, the corporation supposedly determined to gut Scammell and turn it into a cheap badge, was putting fresh capital into the Watford works as late as 1983. You do not build a new factory for a company you are trying to hollow out. You build a new factory for a company you believe in. And what was that gleaming new shop built to produce? The single greatest machine Scammell ever made. Chapter 12. The Commander. To understand the Commander, you have to understand the fear that shaped it. In the early 1980s, the British Army faced the possibility of a Soviet armoured assault across the plains of West Germany. If that attack came, Britain's tanks, the great chieftains, and later the Challengers, would have to be rushed to the front faster than their own tracks could ever carry them. They would have to be driven there, on transporters, at speed, on public roads, keeping pace with ordinary traffic, and the machine that carried them would have to be able to accelerate and brake and hold the road, while balancing 65 tons of tank on its back, as nimbly as a 30-ton articulated lorry running empty. That was the specification. Match an ordinary Arctic's acceleration and braking, while carrying a tank. On the motorway, it was, in the truest Scammell tradition, close to impossible, and Watford built it. They called it the Commander. Development began in 1976 to replace the ageing Thornycroft Antar, and the machines came out of that new construction shop from 1983. At its heart sat a Rolls-Royce engine of colossal size, a 26.5-litre twin-turbocharged V12, producing something like 625 brake horsepower. It ran through a semi-automatic gearbox onto Scammell's own 40-ton bogie, a bespoke, custom, thoroughbred Scammell design, and it could handle gross weights above 100 tons while genuinely keeping up with the traffic. The first one entered service in February 1984. In all, 125 of these magnificent tractor units were built at Watford for one customer, the Royal Corps of Transport. Now hold the commander in your mind and hold the title of this film beside it. One mistake, badge engineering, destroyed Scammell. They forced it to use cheap, generic, shared parts and gutted its custom soul. The commander is the answer to that charge, and the answer is devastating in its simplicity. Here, at the very end of Scammell's independent life, built in a brand new factory paid for by the very corporation supposedly killing it, was a machine of pure, uncompromised, world-beating bespoke engineering, custom engine installation, custom bogie, custom everything. Not a badge glued to a parts bin lorry, but a thoroughbred, arguably the finest thing Watford ever produced. Scammell's custom soul was not gutted. In 1984, it was building the greatest tank transporter the British Army had ever owned, which raises the terrible question that the easy story cannot answer. If Scammell was still this good, if it was still building the commander, still winning the specialist work, still housed in a brand new factory, then why, only 4 years later, was it dead? The answer has nothing to do with axles, and everything to do with a decision made in Holland. Chapter 13. Won and killed in the same breath. In February 1987, two things happened to Scammell in the space of a single month. The first was the best news in the company's history. The second was a death sentence, and they arrived, cruelly, almost together. The good news first, because the men at Watford heard it first, and for a moment it must have felt like vindication. Scammell won the Drops contract. Drops, a demountable load-carrying system for the British Army, was an order for 1,522 vehicles, 1,500 machines. It was the largest order in Scammell's entire 65-year history, and it secured the works, on paper, right through to 1995. After all the decades of building giants in twos and tens and dozens, here, at last, was volume, and security, and a future. The men who had feared for their jobs could breathe. Imagine that feeling on the shop floor, the relief of it, the news passing bench to bench, the quiet certainty that the old firm had done it again, had won on merit, had secured itself for another decade. Scammell had won, and then, in the same month, they learned the rest. Because in that same February of 1987, the government announced that the Leyland truck business, the division Scammell belonged to, was being merged with DAF, the Dutch manufacturer, to form a new company, Leyland DF. The announcement was made by Paul Channon, the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, on the 19th of February. On the British side sat the Rover Group under Graham Day and the head of Leyland Trucks, George Simpson, who would become the UK chief executive of the new combined firm. The Dutch firm DAF would hold the majority, 60%, with the British Rover Group holding 40%. And DAF, looking at its new inheritance, looking at where it had modern plant and spare capacity, made a decision of pure, cold, geographic logic. It would build the Drops vehicles, Scammell's own order, Scammell's own hard-won future, at the modern Leyland plant in Lancashire, and it would close Watford. Read that again, slowly, because it is the true centre of this entire story, and it is nothing like the tale the title promised. Scammell did not die because Leyland made it cheap. Scammell did not die because its axles were shared or its cabs were bought in. Scammell won the biggest order it had ever received, a genuinely world-class, secure, profitable future, and was closed anyway, in the same breath, because a Dutch company that had just acquired it looked at a small, old factory in the suburbs of London and a modern one with spare room in Lancashire, and did the sum. DAF, it was said, had no real interest in what went on behind the Scammell gates. To the new owners, Watford was not 70 years of unmatched engineering genius. It was a line on a map in the wrong place with the wrong overheads, and the order it had won would simply be built somewhere the numbers worked better. There was nothing personal in it. That, perhaps, is the hardest part to bear, that the death of the greatest heavy lorry works in the world was not an act of malice, or even of failure, but of simple administrative tidiness. Somebody, somewhere, needed the figures to balance. Watford was in the way of the figures. The justification, when it came, was about the group, never about Scammell. Paul Channon told the House of Commons that the losses across Leyland trucks were running at £1.5 million a week, and that with losses like that, rationalisation was vital if the business was to have any future at all. And that was true. Of the group, it was the group that was losing £1.5 million a week. Scammell itself was profitable. Scammell had just won 1,500 vehicles worth of work. But you cannot save one profitable limb when the whole body is being restructured around it, and the men doing the restructuring have no particular reason to care which limb they cut. The fight, such as it was fought on the floor of the Commons on the 11th of March, 1987, and it was fought hardest by a man who saw exactly what was being thrown away. John Smith, then Labour's trade and industry spokesman, the man who would one day lead his party, rose and called the closure what he believed it to be, an act of wanton destruction. He laid out the facts that made it so, that Scammell had been profitable in 7 of the 10 years leading up to 1986, that its loss the previous year had been just £3 million, and its projected loss for the coming year only 1. That, with the drops contract in hand, the company had been calculated to have a secure and profitable future for the years between 1988 and 1995. There is still time, he told the House, to stop the wanton destruction of the Scammell plant at Watford, and he offered one detail that ought to be carved somewhere in Watford, a fact about the men on that shop floor that turns the whole thing from a business story into a tragedy. In 68 years, Scammell had lost just 2.5 days to industrial disputes. 2.5 days. In 68 years. A workforce of that loyalty, that steadiness, that quiet pride, the very opposite of the strike-torn image that hung over British Leyland's car plants. And this was to be its reward. Another member, Ian Wrigglesworth, said plainly that Watford had been devastated and completely closed down. Labour put down a formal amendment asking the government not to proceed with the closure. It failed. The town's own Member of Parliament, Tristan Garrell-Jones, was a government whip and so constrained from speaking out in the debate, though he was noted as working hard behind the scenes, pressing on the need to keep Britain's military vehicle capability alive. None of it changed anything. The decision had been made in a boardroom that owed Watford nothing, and it held. Scammell's managing director, Vic Wilkes, the great leader the engineers had trusted, did the only thing a good man could do. He began to explore whether some small independent company might be set up to carry on the special vehicle business, to save something from the wreck, and the men on the floor went on building, because that is what they did, even now. They had won the biggest order in their history, and they had been told to build it so that someone else could finish it, in a factory 150 miles away, in the last months before their own gates closed forever. Chapter 14. The Silence at Tolpits Lane. The end, when it came quietly. It was always going to. This was not a workforce that downed tools and marched. This was a workforce that lost 2.5 days in 68 years. They met their own extinction the way they had met everything else, by turning up and getting on with the work. There was no great drama in the final months. There was something worse than drama. There was the ordinary rhythm of a place still working, still building, while everyone inside it knew the calendar was running out. Think of what that must have been. A man who had given the works 30 years, coming in each morning through the same gates, past the same benches, to build machines for an army that would use them for decades, knowing that in a matter of weeks there would be no gate to come through. The strange, unbearable normality of it, the tea breaks, the talk, the half-finished chassis on the trestles, all of it continuing right up to the edge. In the spring of 1988, the enthusiasts of the Scammell Register, the men who loved these machines, many of them former employees, made a last visit to the works. The 7th of May, 1988. It was, in effect, the factory's farewell. Not an official ceremony, just the people who cared most, walking the floor one final time, among the machines and the memories, in a place that had a few weeks left to live. The last chassis to be built at Watford was a constructor 8-wheeler. There is no grand record of a final ceremony, no photograph of the last man switching off the last light. Just a machine, a good, solid, capable Scammell, coming quietly off the line in a factory that would not build another. And then, at the end of June 1988, the 30th of June, by the register's own careful account, though many will tell you loosely that it was July. The works at Talpitts Lane closed. Around 700 people lost their jobs. That is the honest Watford figure, the one given by John Fidel, who was there and who watched it happen, down from something close to 1,000 in the confident years of the late 1960s. You will see larger numbers quoted, 1,000 and more and higher still. But those larger numbers bundle Scammell together with the Leyland engine and foundry closures elsewhere. The Watford number, the human number, the number of families in that town whose wage came from that works, was around 700. 700 people who had built, between them, some of the most extraordinary machines Britain ever made, who had, in a modest factory beside a branch line station, held the top of the world's heavy transport trade for the better part of a century, and who now walked out through the gates for the last time into a Watford that would have to find something else to be. A works that has been building for 66 years develops a kind of presence, not just the noise of it, though the noise is the first thing you notice, the hooter and the airlines and the clang of steel. It is the movement of people, the hum of a place with a purpose, and when that stops, the silence that fills the space is not really an absence of sound at all. It is the presence of something that should not be there, a silence in the wrong shape. That is what settled over Talpitts Lane in the summer of 1988. A silence in the wrong shape, in a building made for a noise that would never come again. Chapter 15. The trucks that outlived the factory. Here is the cruelty and the strange consolation at the heart of the Scammell story. The company was fragile. The machines were not. The rights to build some of Watford's finest work, the S24, the Nubian crash tender, and the designs for the Crusader and the Commander were bought by a firm called Unipower, which opened a small operation in West Watford at Greenhill Crescent, taking on some of the old Scammell hands and offering spares and support. Later, in 1994, Alvis would acquire it, and the operation would carry on for some years more before finally winding down when it lost a major army transporter competition. But from the very start, there was a condition, and it is a condition that tells you everything about how these endings work. Unipower could have the designs. Unipower could not have the name. The word Scammell, the greatest name in British commercial road transport, was withheld from the men who carried on the actual work. The engineering survived. The name was buried. The people scattered, as people do. John Fidel, the engineer whose testimony has carried so much of this story, who came in 1968 and stayed to the end, moved on to a firm that made recovery equipment, taking his three-dimensional knowledge of the impossible somewhere it could still be used. Others found work where they could. Some followed the designs to Unipower. Some left the trade altogether. The particular skill of building a Scammell, a skill passed down the benches for 2 generations, simply had nowhere left to go. But out on the roads, and out in the deserts of the world, the machines themselves simply refused to die. The last of the old pioneers had soldiered on into the 1980s in Belize, and the Commander, that magnificent last thoroughbred, did something even more remarkable. It went to war for a country whose factory had already been demolished. When Britain deployed to the Gulf in 1991, Scammell commanders went with it, hauling Challenger tanks across the desert, running 17 hours a day, covering hundreds of kilometers of sand, years after the works that built them had fallen silent. And they kept going. The commander served the British Army until May 2004, 16 years after Watford closed. The last convoy of British commanders belonged to No. 19 Tank Transporter Squadron, and when they were finally retired and replaced, around 100 of them were not scrapped but given away, gifted to Jordan, alongside a batch of surplus Challenger tanks, to go on working under a desert sun. Think on that. The factory was demolished in 1988, and the machines it made were still hauling tanks across deserts 16 years later, and then went abroad to serve on for years more. The engineering was so good, so honest, so thoroughly Scammell, that it outlived not just the men who ordered its death, but the very ground the factory had stood on. The products were indestructible. Only the company was fragile. Chapter 16. What remains? Go to Talpitts Lane today, and you will not find the works. It was demolished, and where the biggest lorries in the world once took shape, there is now a housing estate and an industrial park, ordinary as anything, the sort of place you would drive through without a second glance. But the developers did one thing that redeems the concrete a little. They named the streets. Walk through that estate now and you walk down Crusader Way. Explorer Drive, Pioneer Way, Himalayan Way. There is a Scammell Way. The machines are gone. The men are gone. The noise is gone. But the names survive, stamped onto street signs, whispering to anyone who cares to notice that something enormous once stood here. Most who live there will not know. To them, these are simply addresses, a place to park the car and hang the washing. But every so often, someone will look up at a sign that reads Pioneer Way and wonder, and find out, and learn that on this ordinary suburban ground, men once built a lorry so large it needed a second driver on a telephone at the back, just to work the brakes. Down in Spitalfields, at the Fashion Street site, where George Scammell first shaped a cartwheel in the 1890s, there is almost nothing at all to say that any of it began there. But the machines endure, in the hands of the people who love them. The Scammell Register keeps the flame. Hundreds of members, ex-employees and drivers and restorers, preserving the vehicles and the histories and the technical knowledge. 17 of the 18 show tracks still run. Around 30 of the original mechanical horses survive, and 60 of the scarabs, and dozens of the pioneers and explorers and constructors and contractors appearing at the steam fairs and the rallies, polished and cared for and alive. In the spring of 2022, on the 1st of May, 100 years to the season since the works first opened, they gathered at a playing field on Tolpits Lane and held a centenary rally, bringing the machines home, one last time, to the ground where they were born. So what killed Scammell? Not the thing the title promised, not one fatal mistake, not a corporate mandate to glue cheap parts onto a proud old name. That story is too simple and too neat, and it does an injustice to the men of Watford, because it says they built something inferior at the end. They did not. They built the commander. They won the drops. They were profitable and loyal and the best in the world at what they did, right up until the day the gates closed. Scammell died because a small, healthy, brilliant specialist had, 30 years before, sheltered under the wing of a giant. And when that giant finally fell to pieces and was sold off to foreign hands, the specialist was cut away for tidiness in the very month it secured its own future. Not through failure, through being the smallest, oldest limb of a dying body, amputated by people who had never stood on its floor and did not know what they were throwing away. The trucks are still out there, restored, remembered, some of them still working. Machines built to outlast the world that made them, and they have. It is only the world that made them that could not last.